A lot of the time I make things by starting from an idea and then finding the materials for it. But for this one, it all started with this fabric. It reminded me of medieval religious art, as well as of The Apparition by Moreau. It felt like the kind of thing an ancient oracle or priestess would wear, like dusty gems and faded gilding. My mood board also included Game of Thrones, Moulin Rouge, and corset chairs like Royal Black and Sparkle Wren, as well as an Alexander McQueen collection from 2010. I changed my mind about the design a lot, starting with corset-based looks and then a more flowy dress that I even started putting together a pattern for before my mind dragged itself back to corsetry as usual. So here begins the creation of the Prophetess. I started with a corset pattern that I drafted for a previous corset. That one had a hip detail, and I'm now using that hip area as the part of the corset that should flare away from my body. I kind of eyeballed the armhole based on a shirt pattern, and then I estimated the sizing of the part that wraps around the top by wrapping a measuring tape around my shoulders. And at this point, I had no idea how far to flare it out exactly on the hips, so I decided to pin the pattern pieces to a dress form and then flare them out and tape them in the position where I want them to be. Afterwards, I remove it from the dress form again and then use the tape as a guide for extending my pattern pieces. So after this first draft of the pattern, it's time to see how it sits in real life. The mock-up is fully boned, of course, so that I can really judge the fit accurately. And I noticed that the armhole was a bit small and the shoulder a bit narrow, so I cut it open and pinned some extra fabric in between. And this is where I made a mistake. You can see here where I'm adjusting the pattern that I do add to the height, but not the extra width that I cut open earlier. So you'll see me on the next mock-up expanding the shoulder again. The hip flare was cool, but it did look a bit more like a flat shelf than a pointy curl up, so that needs some adjustment as well. At this point, I'm only making half of a new mock-up every time and attaching it to the other half of the original mock-up. That saves me some work and material, and I get to compare some of the changes side by side. I'm quite pleased with the new angle of the front and the side, so now let's try the top. So that's where I'm making another mistake. You see me here noticing that there is a bit of gaping at the front of the arm, and at this point I don't realize why that's happening. So I made the shoulder a bit wider, and the arch over the shoulder is still sort of collapsing downwards. I even tried a bit of supportive boning to try to keep that up, but in the end, what's wrong is that it's an arch to begin with. The boning in that arch wants to go the straightest possible path, causing the arch to be pushed down. So to fix it, I raised the rest of the top edge to form a smooth, straight line for the boning to follow. Finally, I'm moving some seams around so that I can get a nice large center front panel, and I'll center that on one of the circles in the fabric and make that the focal point of the corset. So now it's time for cutting. The first step for cutting obviously is ironing. Here I'm ironing the crap out of my fabric, both to help it lie nice and flat, but also to shrink it. I'm glad that I did that because this acetate upholstery fabric visibly shrinks as soon as I hit it with some steam. Then of course, careful positioning of the pattern pieces to get one of the big circles on the center front, as well as cutting matching pieces for the center back. And for the strength layer, I'm using this black coutil. That's also where I mark all of the notches and boning channels, and that's the fabric that I'm going to use as my source of truth for where stuff is supposed to go. To account for the thickness of the fabric and the curve of the corset, I am doing a bit of roll pinning here, so I'm lining the pieces up in a curved shape and then stitching just inside the seam allowance to keep them together, to give the outer curve a little bit more space than the inner curve. I did something similar to the smaller pieces by curving them up while I was stitching the other side, but I forgot to get that on camera, so here is a low effort reenactment of that. Anyway, despite my best efforts at roll pinning, you'll notice later that there is some bubbling on the inside of the corset. I think I might have underestimated the thickness, and the embroidery that's about to happen later also wasn't helping. So now it's time to assemble the pieces. After stitching and pressing everything, I also top stitch all the seams. That just makes them a bit more crisp. I think here you can just about see that there's a subtle difference in how much of a shadow there is in the ditch of the seam. And while top stitching, I managed to keep most of the seam allowances out of the way as well. So now I'm just trimming everything that I don't need anymore, and since I'm going to be handling this corset a lot for embellishments, I'm converting my chalk markings into water-soluble basting threads. That will keep everything together for now, and then at the end I can just rinse it out. Now it's time for embellishments. I want to add some fake gold leaf, so I did a little experiment to figure out which glue would work the best. I don't mind if it's looking slightly weathered, but I do need it to not fall off when it gets wet. So in the end, E6000 was the winner, and here I am attaching a whole bunch of fake gold to my corset fabric. In addition to the gold leaf, I also want to embroider some rays of light onto the design, which I'm doing by machine with a metallic top stitch thread. So I did some testing with tension settings and stitch lengths first. Here you can see on a test scrap that I initially just sort of doubled back the way I came with long stitches, but I didn't like the way the stitches sat next to each other. So eventually I settled on a system where I'd adjust my stitch length for just one stitch to create a kind of offset, and you get this overlapped effect on the stitches. I figured nobody's gonna notice this but me, and I'm showing it here in this video, so maybe now you can retroactively be slightly more impressed with the result. Please? For the boning channels, I need to center the boning tape on the seams very precisely because I'll be stitching it from the front where I can't see what I'm doing. I initially tried to use some double-sided basting tape to hold them in place, but it let go a bit too easily, so it went way off. So instead I had to pin all of them. Both the boning tape and the seam allowance sandwich are quite thick, so it was a bit of a pain to pin, but it's the result that counts. And now it's time for beads. Many beads. At this point, I was also in a bit of a design crisis. I'd already bought some expensive lace and started cutting pieces out to apply to the corset before deciding that I didn't like the look of it. It was too floral, it didn't work, so I had to come up with something else. So I bought way too much other stuff in the hopes that I'd manage to cobble together something that I actually liked. So here I'm trying to figure out something to do with gold chains, but they didn't make it onto the corset in the end. Instead, I figured I'd just start by adding some detail to the glittery embroidery by adding more beads to it. As you can see, I stuck a bone in the boning channels if I was adding beads near them, just to make sure I didn't accidentally sew through them and close up the channel. I also added some of this gold trim, but it blended in with the background a little bit too well, so you could barely see that it was there. So I tried to make it a bit more distinctive by sewing little beads into it as well. And then finally, I put together this larger beaded piece for the center front. It was my first time trying to build this kind of thing out of beads. It was a bit more wobbly than I expected, but with it being sewn onto the corset in the end, it was pretty stable. Now it's time to think about the lining. I want the inside of the standing collar to be a nice velvety black, but I don't want to line the whole thing in velvet as that's going to get really hot and bulky. So I created a satin lining for the rest of the body. The construction order for this corset was the biggest challenge in general, as I was trying to figure out how to conveniently put everything together. Like, when do the beads go on and where, so that it doesn't mess with any stitching that I need to do afterwards? How far can I go before putting the boning in, because that will make it that much harder to maneuver the corset afterwards? Which parts are harder to do by machine, which parts are harder to do by hand. And that last consideration is why I decided to construct the lining in two separate halves and then install it along the armholes first. That would allow me to do the armholes by machine while everything is lying flat, and then trim and clip the seam allowances and flip them to the right side. The alternative to this would be that I do the larger outer edge of the lining by machine, but then I would have to clip and press the tightly curved armholes separately before hand stitching them together, which seemed like a lot of a headache in terms of getting everything lined up and stopping it from fraying before I even get to sew it. So armholes first, and then I'll do the edges by hand later. So after all the stitching and clipping, here you can see me struggle to figure out how to press this. I was thinking I could find an angle to press the seam open before pressing it flat, but the rest of the corset was massively in the way. So after a bit of struggling and cutting and struggling, I just ended up pressing it flat on a little sleeve board. In an ideal situation, you would understitch this as well, but given how difficult this thing is to maneuver under the machine, I've decided to just rely on pulling the lining fairly taut when I'm attaching it to the outer edges of the corset to keep it from peeping out too much at the armholes. Now I can finally stitch the center front and the center back of the lining together and move on to the boning channels along the top edge. I cut some bias strips of coutil for this, so I would have the malleability along curves of bias tape, but the wear resistance of coutil. Sewing this on also closes up the top of the vertical boning channels that I've already got, so I can start putting bones in those. After that, it's time for the bottom edge as well to close everything up. I'm putting a thinner spiral steel boning along these edges, but even so, I'm really struggling to overcome all the friction, as the length and the curve of the channel is really working against me here. In the end, I opened the channel up halfway and inserted the boning towards either side from there. That way, it's only half a channel at a time that I need to worry about. Now there are only a few things left to do. So first of all, I need eyelets, or grommets, or whatever you want to call them. I like to cut small holes and to then widen them with an awl. That way I have a bit more fabric for the eyelets to hold on to. I drafted this corset to close all the way at the back, but a slight gap is pretty much inevitable, so I'm also adding a Modesty panel behind the lacing so it doesn't show my skin. Because this corset is sewn together at the top, I can actually hang the Modesty panel from there instead of having it attached to one of the sides or tied into the lacing like you would usually do. So here I'm sewing together the back of the lining so that I can then attach the Modesty panel to it as well. And there she is with just one thing left to do, the outer edge of the lining. That I will be doing entirely by hand so that I can get a perfectly clean and invisible finish that covers up the boning channels at the top and the bottom edge. So I put on a thimble and an audiobook, and there we go. It's going quite slowly because the coutil and the boning channel fabric is quite dense. But also the fluff of the velvet is making it quite difficult to see if I've actually stuck the needle through it or not. So I'm having to go back and forth to make sure I'm actually making valid stitches. I would just like to state here that this is most definitely not the 4th or 5th time I've been working on a corset on a train to the event that I'm wearing it at. Okay, so the reason that I left it this late was so that I had more time at home to do the rest of the outfit. First of all, a headpiece to match with the geometric grandeur of the corset. So I designed and 3D printed these pointy stick things myself so that I could give them interesting shapes and glue some extra glitter to them. Of course, showing up in a corset, a crown, and nothing else would be a little bit chilly. So I also spent way too much time trying to very precisely cut a large chiffon circle skirt that I then had to chop down a lot to get the right length anyway. And I also cut, sewed, and then promptly threw away a voile underskirt because it was bunching up on my stockings, just completely unusable. There might be enough fabric left there that I can salvage it to make a top out of at some point maybe. At the end of the day, I found a short skirt at the back of my closet that I very sloppily sewed a pocket onto and called it a day. So as I was rushing to finish all of it, there's no footage of the whole skirt debacle, so you'll just have to imagine that that's what you were watching for the last minute or so. So, with the skirt situation taking about 8 hours, the crown about 6, and a good chunk of untracked time that went to things like drawing the designs, shopping for materials, cutting expensive lace that I ended up throwing away because it was too floral, gilding polymer clay that I then promptly forgot about, and lying awake at night trying to figure out how this whole thing was going to go together, I think it's safe to say that this has been a 100-hour project. So what do I have to show for it? Let's take a look.